In the summer of 1789, the coffee houses of Paris were packed shoulder to shoulder with men who could not stop talking. They argued about bread, about taxes, about a king who had run out of patience, and within a matter of days, a fortress would fall and a monarchy would begin to come apart. The strange part is what fueled every one of those late-night arguments. It was not wine. It was a bitter black liquid that had once been banned by sultans, cursed by priests, and blamed for madness across 3 continents. That liquid was coffee. But to understand how a wild berry from an Ethiopian hillside ended up helping to topple a throne, you have to go back more than 1,000 years, to a plant so suspicious that entire empires once tried to make it disappear. Picture a high forest in the southwest of what we now call Ethiopia, in a region named Kaffa. The air is cool and thin, the kind of cool that makes you want something warm in your hands. Wild shrubs grow in the shade of taller trees, and on their branches sit small berries that ripen into a deep, glossy red. This is the true home of the coffee plant, the place every cup on earth can be traced back to, and the first thing you learn here will sound almost impossible. For most of its history, coffee was not something people drank at all. It was something people ate. Long before there was a barista, long before there was a cafe, the people of these highlands treated the coffee cherry as food and as fuel. They crushed the red berries together with animal fat and rolled the mixture into small, dense balls that a person could carry in a pouch and eat on the move. Picture a hunter slipping through the forest before dawn, or a fighter facing a long day of walking and violence, reaching into that pouch and swallowing one of these bitter, greasy little lumps, and feeling the tiredness lift and the edges of the world go sharp and bright. That was coffee. Not a warm mug on a quiet morning, but a hard knot of fat and seed pressed into the hand of someone who needed his body to keep moving when it wanted to stop. They also let the fruit ferment, and from the soft pulp they made a mild kind of wine, so the very same plant could wake a man for the hunt and then blur the long night that followed it. Think about that for a second. The thing sitting in your cup right now began its life as something you would chew. You have almost certainly heard the story people love to tell about how all of this was discovered. The tale goes that a young goatherd named Kaldi noticed his goats dancing and leaping after they nibbled the bright red berries of a strange bush, that he tried the berries himself, and that he felt a rush of life run through him. It is a lovely story, and I want to be honest with you about it, because this is a channel about history, and not about legend, dressed up to look like fact. That story does not appear anywhere in the record until the year 1671, many centuries after it supposedly happened, and the goatherd was not even given the name Kaldi until the 20th century. In other words, it is a myth, a nice one, but a myth. What actually happened was quieter, and to me, far more interesting. Somewhere in these hills, over a very long time, people learned that this bitter little fruit could hold back sleep and sharpen a tired mind. And a discovery like that does not stay on a mountainside for long, because just across a narrow stretch of sea, in the highlands of Yemen, coffee finally found the thing that would transform it forever. It found men who were desperate to stay awake in order to pray. By the 15th century, Sufi mystics in Yemen were roasting the seed, grinding it, and brewing it into a hot, dark drink that they passed from hand to hand during their long night devotions. For a devout man, to nod off during the night prayers was to fail God himself, and this dark cup was the small miracle that held his eyes open until dawn. One of the earliest real names we can attach to this is a religious scholar in the port city of Aden, remembered for embracing the drink around the year 1454. They called it kahwa, a word that had once been used for wine, and if you say it out loud, you can almost hear the word you use every single day hiding inside it. And this is the moment coffee stopped being a local secret and became a global business, because the Yemeni traders understood exactly what they were holding. Nearly all of that coffee flowed out to the world through a single port on the Red Sea, a place called Mocha, the one doorway coffee had to the outside world. You still see that name on menus today, printed next to drinks that have never been anywhere near Yemen. And the men who controlled that doorway did something both clever and ruthless to keep their grip on it. They made sure that every bean leaving the country was roasted or boiled first, scorched just enough that no one who bought it could ever plant it and grow their own. You were welcome to drink Yemeni coffee anywhere on earth. You were simply never allowed to grow it. A wild berry from a mountain had become a state secret, guarded like a vein of gold. Which leaves you with an obvious question. If a thing is protected that fiercely, what happens the day people decide they want it badly enough to break every rule around it? And stranger still, why would kings and priests, men with armies and prisons, come to be afraid of a warm drink? This is where the story turns, and it is the first great secret of coffee. For centuries, the drink you now consider the most harmless thing on your table was treated as a genuine danger to public order, and in more than one place, being caught with it could cost you your life. In the year 1511, in the holy city of Mecca, a powerful official named Khair Beg made an unpleasant discovery. Men were gathering in the city's coffeehouses, and among the things they passed around were verses that mocked him by name. To a man in his position, that was not a joke. That was the sound of authority slipping. He gathered physicians and religious scholars, convinced them that the drink was intoxicating and harmful, and had coffee formally declared forbidden. The coffee houses were shut, and the people who defied the order were beaten. But the ban did not hold, and it is important that you understand why, because the same reason repeats through this entire story. Coffee was already too loved, and far too profitable, for any one official to kill it. Within a little over a decade, the prohibition was overturned by order from higher up the chain of power. And in one of those small, brutal ironies that history seems to specialize in, it was Khair Beg himself who ended up executed, while the ruler above him went on to declare coffee something close to sacred. The man who tried to ban the drink was gone. The drink stayed. You might imagine that was a one-time panic, a single nervous governor overreacting. It was not. Roughly a century later, in the Ottoman capital of Istanbul, a sultan named Murad IV took the fear of coffee to a place that is genuinely hard to picture from where you sit. At first, the punishment for drinking it was almost mild, a beating or being sewn into a leather sack and thrown into the waters of the Bosphorus. But he kept tightening the screw until the penalty was simply death. The stories told about him claim that he would pull ordinary clothes over his royal identity and walk the streets of his own capital at night, and that anyone he caught drinking coffee in the dark could be cut down where they stood. Whether every detail of that is true or has grown taller in the retelling, the core of it is real. A ruler was so unsettled by this drink that he was willing to kill his own citizens over it. And it was not only the East. When coffee first arrived in Europe by way of the Mediterranean trade, it made people deeply uneasy. In Venice, some members of the clergy looked at this dark foreign brew, so closely tied to the Muslim world, and called it the bitter invention of Satan. There is even a story, and I will flag for you that it sits somewhere between history and legend, about a Swedish king so convinced that coffee was a slow poison that he ordered a condemned prisoner to drink it every day for the rest of his life, as an experiment, expecting it to kill him. As the tale goes, the coffee drinker outlived everyone involved in the experiment, including the king. True or not, that story survives for a reason. It captures exactly how threatening this ordinary drink once seemed to the people in charge. So stop and ask yourself the real question. Why would powerful men with treasuries and soldiers be frightened of something you pour without a second thought? The answer is the single quality that sets coffee apart from almost everything else on your table. Wine and beer make people slow, warm, and easy to manage. Coffee does the exact opposite. It makes people alert, awake, and inclined to sit up late and talk about the men who rule them. It was never really the drink they feared. It was the room the drink created, and every time a king moved to stamp coffee out, what he was really trying to do was close that room. They failed, over and over, because that room was about to become one of the most powerful inventions in the history of the modern world. If you are enjoying this, do me one small favor and hit the subscribe button, because the next turn in this story is the part that genuinely stuns people, and I would hate for you to miss where it goes. Those same coffee houses that terrified sultans and unsettled priests went on to build the machinery of modern money. When coffee reached England in the middle of the 17th century, coffee houses spread through London so quickly that people gave them a nickname. They called them penny universities. For the price of a single cup, 1 penny, an ordinary person could sit for hours in a room full of merchants, sea captains, scientists, and writers, and get something close to an education simply by listening and joining in. These were not lazy places where people killed an afternoon. They were engines of information, and each one drew its own particular crowd. And the things those crowds built are still running today, right now, whether you realize it or not. One of these London coffee houses was owned by a man named Edward Lloyd, and because it sat near the docks and filled up every day with sailors, ship owners, and traders, it became the place you went if you wanted to insure a voyage, to place a wager on whether a particular ship would ever come home. Men would gather there, share the latest shipping news, and quietly agree to cover one another's losses if a ship went down in a storm or vanished to pirates. When a man accepted a slice of that risk, he signed his name on the line beneath the details of the voyage, and that small act, a signature written under a line of writing, is exactly where the word on your own insurance policy comes from. He was an underwriter. That single coffee house grew, over the years, into Lloyd's of London, one of the most famous insurance markets on the face of the earth. Another coffee house, called Jonathan's, was where men met to buy and sell shares in ventures. And out of that smoky room grew what became the London Stock Exchange. The great auction houses whose names you know, the ones that sell single paintings for tens of millions, trace their beginnings to sales held in these very rooms. By the 1700s, London had hundreds of these coffee houses, each one a little parliament of its own trade. I want you to hold that for a moment because it is easy to let it slide past. The insurance on your car, the stock market that quietly moves your retirement savings up and down while you sleep. The entire architecture of modern finance grew up around cups of the exact drink you now consider too ordinary to even notice. The thing that kings tried to outlaw precisely because it made people gather and talk had become the place where the modern economy was born. The room they were so desperate to shut down did not just survive. It started printing money. But talk is a very hard thing to keep on a leash, and it does not always stay on the safe subject of shipping and shares. Because the same kind of room that gave the world insurance and stock markets also gave the world revolution. Cross back over to Paris and step into a cafe called Procope, which for years drew in the sharpest and most restless minds in France. The writers and philosophers, whose ideas about liberty and equality were slowly loosening every bolt in the old order, sat at those tables and argued for hours, fueled by cup after cup. Voltaire was a regular there. So was Rousseau. And in the fevered days at the end of the 1780s, so were the men whose names would soon be written in blood across the Revolution. Men like Marat, Robespierre, and Danton. Then, on a Sunday in the middle of July in 1789, all of that restless cafe energy finally spilled out of the rooms and into the street. The king had just dismissed a popular minister, and the city read the move as the first step toward a violent crackdown on anyone who wanted change. In the garden of the Palais Royal, surrounded by cafes, a young and mostly unknown journalist named Camille Desmoulins climbed up onto a table outside the Café de Foix. He had struggled with a stammer his whole life, a stammer that had wrecked his hopes of being a lawyer. But in that one electric moment, with a crowd staring up at him, the words came out clean and unbroken. He told them a massacre was coming. He told them they had to arm themselves now, this instant, not tomorrow. He reached up, tore a green leaf from a tree, and held it high as a symbol for the crowd to wear so they would know one another. 2 days later, the Bastille fell. The revolution that would reshape the entire Western world took one of its first real breaths outside a coffee house, over a drink that a sultan had once tried to ban. And do not imagine for a second that this was only a European story. The very same thing was brewing on this side of the Atlantic. In Boston, the taverns and coffee houses were where colonists quietly planned the resistance that would become the American Revolution. And after those colonists famously dumped British tea into the harbor in protest, choosing coffee over tea turned into a kind of patriotic statement. To drink coffee was, in a small way, to declare which side you were on. Really sit with that. A great deal of the freedom you take for granted, the plain right to sit in a public place and say out loud what you think about the people in charge, was argued into existence by wide-awake men in rooms that smelled of roasted coffee. The drink did not simply witness those arguments. It kept them burning past midnight. So by now the pattern is impossible to miss. A drink that started its life as a lump of food pressed into an Ethiopian hand had, in the space of a few centuries, been banned by emperors, then used to build the banks, and then used to help burn down thrones on 2 continents. But here is the part nobody tells you, and it is the part that turns this entire story dark. All of that coffee, the cups in Paris, the cups in London, the cups in Boston, had to come from somewhere. You cannot grow coffee in England, or in France, or in Massachusetts. The plant demands heat and altitude, and a particular kind of climate, and by this point, Europe craved far more of it than the old port of Mocha could ever hope to supply. And so, to feed the habit, the Europeans took the plant, and the true price of filling all those cups was about to be paid, not in coins, but in human beings. There is a famous story about how coffee crossed the ocean, and it is worth telling for what it reveals. A French naval officer named Gabriel de Clieu claimed that he carried a single precious coffee seedling by ship across the Atlantic to the Caribbean, and that when the voyage dragged on and fresh water ran dangerously low, he shared his own drinking ration with the little plant, day after day, to keep it alive, while men aboard went thirsty. I will be straight with you. That is the version he told about himself many years later, and coffee had in truth already reached those islands through other hands before his voyage. But whether it was really him or someone whose name we lost, the outcome is the same, and the outcome is the point. Once that plant took root in the warm colonies of the New World, it created a hunger that would consume hundreds of thousands of lives. The dark center of that hunger was a French colony on the island we now call Haiti, known back then as Saint-Domingue. By the late 1780s, this one colony was producing somewhere around 60% of all the coffee in the world. It had become, by many measures, the single richest colony on the planet, a place that made French families fabulously wealthy and filled the coffee houses of Paris and Hamburg with cheap, plentiful beans. And you need to understand exactly how that wealth was manufactured, because the polished cup and the bleeding field were never 2 different stories. They were always the same story, seen from opposite ends. That staggering fortune was built on the backs of roughly 500,000 enslaved African men, women, and children, held in place by a tiny ruling population of perhaps 32,000 colonists. The coffee was grown high on the steep, punishing mountainsides, and the people forced to grow it were worked until their bodies gave out. They were underfed, housed in windowless huts, and treated as machinery that happened to breathe. And remember Lloyd's of London, that respectable coffee house that grew into a gleaming insurance empire. It insured the ships that carried enslaved people across the ocean into that system. Over the long span of the trade, Britain's shipping industry transported an estimated 3 million or more enslaved Africans, and the polite men in the London coffee house helped underwrite the risk. The world of the delicate porcelain cup and the world of the chained hand were bound together, tightly, from the very beginning. I am going to step outside the history for just one sentence, because I think it matters, and I do not want to hide behind neutrality here. The cruelest irony in all of this is that the people sitting in those Paris cafes, sipping Saint-Domingue coffee, while they wrote gorgeous words about liberty and equality and the rights of man, were being served by a crop grown in chains a few thousand miles away, and the enslaved people who grew that crop heard those same ideas drifting across the ocean, and unlike almost everyone else, they took them completely seriously. On a hot night in August of 1791, deep in the woods of the northern plain, they gathered for a secret ceremony, and out of that gathering came an uprising. Within weeks, they had put hundreds of coffee and sugar plantations to the torch, and what began as a desperate revolt hardened into the only slave revolution in all of recorded history to fully succeed. Its most important leader was a man named Toussaint Louverture, who had himself been born into slavery on a plantation, and who somehow turned a furious, scattered rebellion into a disciplined army that beat back the French, the Spanish, and the British in turn. Napoleon could not stand it. He sent a massive expedition across the Atlantic to crush the revolt and force those people back into chains, and when raw force alone would not do it, the French reached for a lie instead. They invited Toussaint to a meeting under a promise of safety, arrested him the moment he arrived, and shipped him across the sea to France, where they locked him inside a cold stone fortress high in the mountains near the Swiss border. There, denied a doctor and even firewood in a freezing cell, the man who had beaten 3 empires died alone in the spring of 1803. But before they took him, he said something that turned out to be exactly right. In cutting him down, he warned, the French had only chopped through the trunk of the tree of liberty, and it would grow back from the roots, because the roots were deep, and there were many of them. Within a year, it did. His generals finished what he had started. The French were driven off the island for good, and a nation of free people declared itself into existence. And the shock of that defeat was so complete that France abandoned its ambitions on this entire side of the world and sold a vast stretch of North America to the young United States in the deal you learned about in school as the Louisiana Purchase. Pause on that for a moment. A huge piece of the map of your own country was redrawn, in part, because enslaved people who grew coffee decided they would rather die free than keep filling the cups of the men who owned them. And yet the machine did not stop, because the world's craving for coffee never once slowed down. When one source of cheap labor rose up and shattered, the growing simply moved somewhere else. It moved in a huge way to Brazil, which built its own coffee fortune on the same foundation of enslaved labor and did not abolish slavery until 1888, making it the very last country in the Americas to do so. Over time, the whole business became industrialized. Coffee grew cheaper, faster to produce, and more universal, until it quietly stopped feeling like a luxury and started feeling like a right, something you simply expect to have within reach when you open your eyes in the morning. Today, the 2 largest coffee producers on Earth are Brazil and Vietnam, and the plant that once crept out of a single guarded port on the Red Sea now circles the entire globe before it lands, still warm, in your kitchen. So the same dark liquid that Sufi mystics brewed to stay awake for God, the same brew that a sultan was ready to behead people over, the same cup that funded the stock market and lit the fuse of the French Revolution and was harvested by people in chains, is sitting in front of 100 million human beings this very morning, as though it were nothing at all, as though it were just coffee. And that, in the end, is the thing I keep coming back to with everything we put on this table. We tell ourselves that the dangerous objects in human history are the obvious ones, the weapons, and the crowns, and the treasure. But it is almost never true. The objects that truly move the world are the ones that learned how to look boring, the ones so woven into daily life that you stopped seeing them a long, long time ago. The cup in your hand is not a small thing pretending to be big. It is one of the most consequential objects our species has ever passed from person to person, and it survived every attempt to control it precisely by becoming ordinary enough to ignore. So let me leave you with this. The next time you pour it, before you take that first automatic sip, hold the cup for just a second longer than usual, and notice that you are holding several centuries of desire, and money, and rebellion, and unspeakable cruelty, all of it cooled down into a warm and forgettable habit. Then tell me, honestly, in the comments below, now that you know what it carried to reach you, will your next cup taste even slightly different? I read every answer, and if this changed the way you look at the thing beside you right now, then stay close, because there is another everyday object waiting on your table, with a story every bit as heavy, and I will be here when we lift the lid on it.